to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this episode. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, right outside of Portland. Strange place. But once you get outside of the city limits, it gets pretty normal quick. And so my church is actually in Battleground, Washington, which is one of the coolest places in America. Anyway, I write books, and I just finished the latest book, and it's entitled St. Anthony's Guide to the AI Apocalypse, or Surviving the AI Apocalypse. But anyway, that's enough of that. So I'm going to kick it over to you, Tom, and then Glenn, give us a little snippet about your adventure on the other side of the pond, and then we'll kick it over to our guest for the day.
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, moral theology, and philosophy, a few other things. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. I do some ministry work, and hopefully this summer I will finally have wrapped up one of my long-awaited writing projects. So I've been pen to mouth.
Great. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah.
And I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a retired history professor, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I have my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries, through which I just conducted a tour of Ireland. And I am back just today, severely jet-lagged and sleep-deprived, so this could be a very entertaining episode.
That's right.
We actually traveled around the entire island of Ireland, mostly basically around the perimeter. And so we were in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland both. We saw a lot of sites connected with the early Celtic saints, which is what the topic of the tour was. I did historical lectures on the bus, and then we had tour guides or self-guided tours on the ground at a whole bunch of sites around Ireland.
Nice. So before we get to Jake, I just want to note that we are going to be in Chattanooga next week for the PCA General Assembly, and this show is coming out on Monday, I think. And consequently, if you're hearing it on Monday and you're down in that part of Tennessee and you want to drop in and see us, I think you can do it. But we'll be in the display hall there at the SHM Architects booth and conducting a number of interviews on Wednesday and Thursday. Anyway, it's great to have Pastor Jake Dell with us. And Jake, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm Pastor Jake Dell. I'm the pastor of the First Congregational Church in Woodbury, Connecticut. It's an old church, goes back about at least 355 years. So it's one of those old Connecticut standing order churches. The Ecclesiastical Society that predates the church by about a decade was founded in 1659, which means that it was, the town and the church were originally one and the same thing back in those days.
Yeah.
There was a pioneer column that came up from Stratford, the second generation, if you will, of pilgrims. Left Stratford. They split with the church in Stratford over something called the Halfway Covenant, which we might be familiar with here. I've been relearning all about that. So my church for the first generation was a Halfway Covenant church, and then early in the I want to say late in the 18th century, it moved on from abandoned the Halfway Covenant and became, I guess, a normal sort of, by then, Congregational church. And it just was interesting to me how Anglican its theology kind of went back to becoming after nearly 150 years of trying to get away from the Church of England.
It has a way of doing that.
They eventually come full circle and realize, well, if you're not a heretic and you can at least consent to the creeds without crossing your fingers, and you can be a church member. So I find that interesting. I do think that kind of comes into the story, though, later on, maybe, of what we're trying to discuss here about why these denominations, why these churches have seemed to have failed so spectacularly. But anyway, so the church is about 355 years old. It nearly closed. In fact, in 2019, they voted to suspend their worship. And I think they were prepared probably after that to take the next step and close the church. But I think providentially, God intervened with the hand of COVID, which prevented them from taking that step. And instead, what happened was a small little remnant continued to meet in the church. Maybe we're talking about 8 to 10 members who just kind of kept it going, meeting at once a quarter for communion or whatnot. And then last year in 2024, they decided to try one more time to see if they could call a minister. I was at that time in the process of leaving the Episcopal Church. I was ordained a priest in the Episcopal Church, and I served in that happily for 15 years. We can talk more about that if you like. But I was moving out of the Episcopal Church, and I was looking for congregations that had some history and roots to them, but would be, I suppose, orthodox or conservative enough at the congregational level that they would be interested in hiring me, but at the same time autonomous and free enough so that I wouldn't have to cut through sort of the denominational Gordian knots that I was found myself being entangled in. So I happened to see the advertisement for this job posted on a group called Faithful and Welcoming Churches, which is a somewhat fairly conservative group within the United Church of Christ. Dr. Bob Thompson, who retired from the church, UCCC Church in Hickory, North Carolina, Corinth, started that group. And he basically made it his mission to maintain an evangelical, conservative, orthodox, or traditional witness in the United Church of Christ. So I was on his email list. I found out about the church from that email list. I applied, and about 6 weeks later, I was candidating and got called and started here last November. So here I am.
Yeah, that's an amazing story, Jake. And there's some other interesting things about it.
Before
we
go there, I just sort of want to make a comment about the founding of the church.
Mm-hmm.
That's the story, or something like the story of pretty much every town in Connecticut. Somebody gets into an argument with their pastor, and they leave and they go out into what was then the wilderness and start their own church.
That's right.
That's pretty much the story of every town in Connecticut.
Well, there's a plaque in our church where it shows all of the daughter churches that this church founded, and most of those were happily, just the result of growth and people moving farther away. But one was because they couldn't decide where to build the church, so they split over that.
Well, there's a joke in church growth circles that basically you plant churches or split, but either way you end up with more than one church, and that's a good thing.
That's right. Church multiplication.
Church splitting may be a method, right? A good method.
That's right. Well, I can say praise God that since I've been here in the last 6 months, we've doubled the size of the congregation. Now, if you were listening, you noticed that there were only about 8 to 10 of us, but we've still doubled. And so we had a new membership class come through, about 10 new people, and we've got about 7 more that may join us in the fall. So, God is blessing it.
Well, that's yeah. I was going to say one point there. It just also gives a lot of, or we should give a lot of praise in many ways to those faithful remnants who hold these. We had something similar to a church that I go to. It's a pre-revolutionary line coming out of the Episcopal Church, and it was 9 people that held faithfully week in, week out, into where they finally did take that risk one more time. And it has now, similarly, it has jumped. So I think that fidelity to the gospel, even in a place that's a dry well like Connecticut, draws and evokes. The Spirit definitely does something rich there.
That's for sure, yeah.
Well, this is actually a nice segue into talking about what we want to get into. But before we do that, I want to also dip into a little bit of your own personal history. You were in the Episcopal Church. I was baptized Episcopalian. I think people who are not in the sort of the East Coast, not on the East Coast, may not have an appreciation for just how significant the old historic churches are and how much real influence they still have. And that's, by the way, one reason why the liberals, the left, were so desirous of them and taking them over. Not only that, but also the fact that sometimes there was pretty significant endowment, so you didn't actually need to worry about, actually ministering. It'd be a sinecure, and and basically, get involved in politics, which was what you really wanted to do, and or social work or some kind. And so anyway, so many of the churches suffer from this kind of. I would say, they're the people that the Lord was talking about when he was talking about hired hands. When the money runs out, then they finally leave. And then that's when you end up with these remnants who are just desperate enough to call a conservative.
That's right. and And I think, that very much describes what happened to me. I was a conservative in the Episcopal Church, and I didn't hide that. And anybody who would have looked at my resume would have known immediately. It basically had the word conservative stamped all over it. I was ordained through the Diocese of Albany at the time under a man named Bishop William Love, who
I know Bishop Love. Yeah,
and he was one of the conservative bishops still in the Episcopal Church at the time, and he was part of a larger network called the Communion Partners, which at the time when it was founded, maybe about 30 bishops in the Episcopal Church who basically said, we want to align with the larger Anglican communion on issues of human sexuality and orthodoxy and things like that. And so for a while there was actually still a decent group of conservative, traditional, faithful Episcopal bishops. So I was ordained through his diocese. I went to Nashotah House Theological Seminary, which has a reputation for being very Anglo-Catholic. And even then I was fairly low church Protestant Episcopalian, but it was a good school and a good education. And so, what I'm saying, there was no secret what my theology was, but as I have often said, I was hiding in plain sight. There was sort of a tacit don't ask, don't tell, certainly don't preach this. And that worked. I found I could generally be pretty I was always Orthodox, but I could generally be fairly evangelical in my preaching and, preach a good sermon, but I would pull my punches and I wouldn't necessarily draw out all of the implications of a gospel reading. And, in the Episcopal Church, we preach usually from the lectionary, and it's interesting how the Revised Common Lectionary will omit some of the harder passages. And so eventually I got to the point where I'd throw those passages back in and see
the longer passages.
And they did start to notice. And I would say that there was certainly a sea change after 2015, after Obergefell was passed, it was handed down. I was at the General Convention of the Episcopal Church in June of 2015, when almost within a span of 48 hours, Obergefell was handed down by the Supreme Court, and then the Episcopal Church changed its marriage canons. So all of a sudden, I went from at least having both the law and the church law on my side, even though the tide was clearly moving in one direction. I could always at least stand on those two principles, to having both of those principles, cut out from underneath my feet. And I'll never forget when the convention hall erupted into applause, and everybody was cheering that both the Supreme Court decision and the change to the marriage canons. But so many people were coming up to me and assuring me, Jake, there will always be a place for you in the Episcopal Church. We need your voice. We need your witness. You are just as much a part of this church as we are. And I think at the time it was sincerely held, but or sincerely said. But over the next decade, I found that that promise wore thin. It seemed like as the country went insane with woke ideology after 2020 and COVID, that the church, the diocese, the bishops just all doubled down on things like critical race theory and gender, fluidity, genderism, ideology. And so I found in my last church, the last Episcopal church that I served, I wasn't even preaching about same-sex relationships or anything like that, but just the mere fact that people knew I would not do a same-sex marriage was enough to get at least a sizable percentage of people upset with me, right? So, and that led eventually to, I think, the end of it certainly led me to resign from that pulpit and move on. But what really made the Episcopal Church, impossible for me to continue in was something that that I got involved with called Operation Reconquista, which, if you're familiar with Redeem Zoomer, he's got a huge following of at least 500,000 people on YouTube. And his whole deal was that he would play Minecraft and narrate, various expound various theological points while he was playing Minecraft, and eventually landed on the idea that he was going to retake the Protestant denominations, mainline Protestant denominations. And you stop me if you want me to, if you have any questions, but I'll just keep going on this tangent if that's what you want me to do.
But this is rich stuff. I mean, so we're familiar with Redeem Zoomer. We've never had him on the show, and I'm not. Very knowledgeable. I mean, I've just heard the name and understand what he's up to in terms of his hopes and his work to try to do what you just described, win back those churches. You're going to say something, though, Tom.
I was going to catch you there because I meet regularly with, because I'm in the Anglican, the ACNA, but I meet regular with Episcopalians that are orthodox in hiding. I won't give away names.
Right.
But one of the things I do here is the intensification of the wokeness all the way down to micro-evaluating the sermons to make sure that this woke material is being communicated enough.
Yeah. I'm sure it's gotten that bad. I never had the bishop care what I preached, but I wouldn't be surprised to hear that. So, yeah.
So, but this brings up something I think is worth noting, and that is that larger sort of cultural trends, I think we're all aware that they play a role in terms of creating expectations and shaping the way people think, and even when it comes to traditionally evangelical and ostensibly conservative churches. But the law, there's an underappreciation, I think, particularly in those circles, for just how the law has an effect on things that you just described, Jake. Preaching, church polity, all sorts of stuff.
Right.
Anyway, I'd like to get a little bit more into your personal background. So you're a Yalie, so
Yes.
you're a guy who's got a background in the Ivies, and I think that's a really significant thing to sort of think a little bit about. Yale having its roots in a breakaway movement. Speaking of splits, from Harvard, because Harvard was no longer orthodox enough for some guys, and so they established it. And now Yale has a reputation for being maybe even more woke than Harvard.
Amazingly so, yeah.
But there is the Jonathan Edwards connection there,
Sure.
and there's this really significant history of Reformed thought and Congregationalism, particularly in Connecticut, and so this is something that we've talked a little bit about here and there. Glenn was at a Congregational church, and he was ordained in the Four Cs.
No, it's not ordained in the Four Cs. I was ordained in First Church. I am not affiliated with a large organization, which is one of the things that kind of leaves me a little frustrated right now. But that's
So explain how that works, though, Glenn. Now, I know that with congregational polity, church is ordained. I was just thinking that you would be de facto part of that group. Maybe that's just not the way it works.
First Church is not into the Four Cs.
Oh, I see. Okay. So is it a UCC or is it just independent?
While I was on the church board at First Church, we escaped from the UCC.
So here in New England, for those...
It is actually a completely independent congregational church.
Okay. Well, for those who are not in the New England area or in the Northeast, the joke is Unitarians considering Christ is what UCC stands for.
Right. Yeah. By the way, you talk about Yale. I've got a better one for you. Hartford Seminary.
Hartford
Seminary started as a conservative alternative to Andover Newton.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And now it's been completely captured by the left. Hartford Seminary has such a big endowment that it could operate without any students.
Yeah. Well, and you have a lot of churches in the Episcopal Church and probably some of the other main lines that could operate without a congregation. And that's one of the things that I'm interested in, in terms of how do you take this, for lack of a better word, Reconquista to the next level. And I think that may be one of the areas to start to look at. What was the intent behind these endowments? And did the donors really intend for them to go towards, the social contagion that spreads among the transgender community, or the blessing of same-sex marriages, or even back in the day, someone like John Shelby Spong or Bishop Pike denying the divinity of Christ with the resurrection of Jesus. So, no one's really taken a hard look at the donor intent, but I came across a case in my own church here, this Congregational church, where going back to the idea of the halfway covenant, the pastor who built and donated the parsonage to the church stipulated in his will that if the church ever reverted to the halfway covenant, that the parsonage would have to revert to his heirs. Well, that's 200 years ago, but it raises an interesting question. How many bequests are out there with theological stipulations attached to them? And I know in the Episcopal Church, we had the prayer book wars over the 1928 prayer book or the 1979 prayer book. And there are, I know this, trusts and endowments and gifts that are set up that become null or must be clawed back if if the church ever switches to the new prayer book or whatnot. And my thought is that might be an avenue to really start to explore, because money talks is what I find. And what I found is if you simply try to walk in through the front door, the institution will do everything it can to gatekeep you out. Or if you somehow manage to get in, like I did, they will keep you silent. So I'm not completely convinced that the best way to take these, to try to recover these churches is to just simply with brute force just sort of come in and try to overwhelm the structures with people and men seeking to be ordained. I think as you say, they've got enough money to operate without anybody.
Right. Yeah. So let's explore.
Hold on. There's some history here that is worth noting. When we were in the process of, as I said, of escaping from the UCC, I did a lot of research into the history of the UCC. Mm-hmm. The UCC formed as a result of several different denominations coming together.
Right.
So that's the united part of it. Church, sort of. Christ, I'm not so convinced of anymore. But in any event, there was a very large endowment for foreign missions. Mm-hmm. And what ended up happening is the liberals got themselves appointed to the board of the missions agency, which had all of this money from all these denominations, then voted to dissolve the missions agency and revert the money back to the larger organization. So they've pulled stunts like this regularly.
Exactly. No kidding.
And actually, the other weird thing about the UCC is its structure. It's unlike anything else on the planet. You've got individual congregations. You have, I forgot what it's called, but sort of a regional level. And then you've got the national level.
Yeah. Right.
Each one is independent of the other.
Right.
So the person speaking on a regional level can speak for the regional level, but can't speak for the churches below them within the region.
That's right. Yeah.
So it sounds like they're speaking for the entire, New England region. They're not. Right. They're speaking just for the leadership at that level, not for any of the churches. Right. So it's a crazy setup in a lot of ways, but I think it's deliberately structured that way to allow institutional capture and to allow the elites in these higher levels to sound like they're speaking for all the churches when they're not.
That's right. That makes sense to me. Yeah, I could see that. But the reality is that the autonomy at the congregational level has never been lost. Yeah. I mean, that principle of Congregationalism, at least here in Connecticut, despite all of the history, despite the history of something like the Saybrook Platform or the consociations and the associations that came out of that, despite the fact that there was establishment at one point and that Hartford was this sort of court of final appeal, the principle of the congregation's autonomy, absolute autonomy, has held firm. Even if it's somewhat dormant at times, even if these congregations allow themselves to be cowed by those higher ups who, I've seen some of them wearing clerical collars and even purple shirts, like they're some kind of Episcopal bishop. And I'm thinking, I know what that really is, and I know you're not that. So,
yeah, they may not actually know the significance of a purple shirt. They just may like purple. We don't know. But.
Right, maybe that's it. Okay.
Right. So you're trying to formalize this, though, Jake. This is something that it's not just like an idea that you've been mulling over or just a kind of a thing that you're just shooting from the hip about. You're actually working on something.
So I'm working on it in the sense that I've drafted a few documents, some what I call a mission brief and a couple of case studies that I've shopped around or I am shopping around. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to talk about this now with your audience because, basically the idea is that if there are bequests out there that are being where the donor intent is being ignored, the heirs to those bequests have some interest, and those heirs might be persuaded to press their claims, at least in the form of exploratory or getting discovery to see, okay, well, what is actually going on here, right? And so, if you're familiar with the idea of a litigation trust, it's basically an idea where you create a corporation where potential beneficiaries, you're basically creating a class. Potential beneficiaries would assign their claim to the trust, and then in return they would get some specified payout if there's any recovery. But it also creates an opportunity for the attorneys and the trust itself for the attorneys to get paid, but for the trust itself to acquire capital for which it can do some beneficial purpose or put it to some good end. And my idea would be that if this litigation trust could get off the ground, and if it could, work in a friendly venue where it could at least be granted discovery, we could hire genealogists, we could hire historians, we could get professional opinions from theologians to look at things like the benefaction or the bequest that donated the parsonage to my church, and say, in cases like this, is the intent of the donor still being honored? And if not, go to these denominations, and I wouldn't go to the individual congregations necessarily, but to their denominations, because that's where everything tends to roll up to, and as you say, that's where the capture actually has taken place. And say, look, you need to address this claim here, and then whether it would be actually litigated or not, I think would depend on the strength of the case and the class action. But you could press for something like a settlement and say, in lieu of actually litigating this, you're going to sign a settlement, pay a certain amount into the litigation trust. The heirs would get something out of it, which would be their incentive to assign their claim, and then the money could be used to pay for the seminary educations of men that could go into these old historic churches like mine, and to pay for their education, to pay and cover for their salaries, or at least help out with their salaries, their benefits, healthcare, retirement, all the things that a denomination or a mid-level judicatory should be doing but isn't doing. All of the gatekeeping, because they're gatekeeping, conservatives out. And I think part of the settlement would have to be some sort of, consent decree, if that's, for lack of a better word, that basically says, we're not going to interfere with these churches trying to call the men to their pulpits that they want to call. And so it seems to me that some kind of, legal aspect to the Reconquista has to be taken seriously if the Reconquista is going to be successful.
Right. So, with regard to the documents that you've developed, are those available, or are they still just sort of private?
There haven't. So what I'm trying to do, at least over the summer, was at least get one or two people to help me fund it and get it off the ground. I'd like to get a website. I'd like to, part of this is that I took someone said the word sinecure before, and that could certainly describe my position in the Episcopal Church before. I was, the Episcopal Church, for whatever else it is certainly the gold standard of clergy compensation. So I went from a pension plan, a denominational health plan, and a generous salary and all that, to really a fraction of almost what I was making when I graduated college 30 years ago. So part of me is looking to see if I can raise some funds here to get this idea off the ground, at least initially, and be the spokesperson for it and draw some income from it. We need to develop a website for it, and so I'm really just looking for that initial interest at this point, so that I can get the website up and running, promote the idea, and shop it around more effectively to people who might be interested. Like I said, I'd like to actually be able to pay some attorneys to look at this. I'd like to be able to pay some genealogists to do the research and some historians to give their opinion on it. So that's the stage I'm at right now. I do have a case study that I can share, and it's about the litigation trust. So I can throw a link to that to you, and you can put it in the show notes if you want. But that's about as far as I've gotten.
Now, we've got a number of people in our audience, thousands, and I imagine that there are some people out there whose eyebrows are going up right now, and they're kind of thinking through, hey, my ancestors are from that part of the country, or I grew up in a, say, PCUSA church or something else, and I know that it was once a sound congregation, and I'd love to see what could be done to recover that ministry for the gospel. Mm-hmm. So hopefully we'll be able to send some people your way.
That would be great.
Make sure we put some ways to get in touch with you in the show notes. Now, you've also written a little bit for the American Reformer. Got a few articles connected to that. I think that's a great location for this, for your thoughts on these matters. That's kind of right up their alley.
Yeah, they've been very helpful and receptive to that. So I think I've got several, 4 or 5 articles out there right now, and they've allowed me to talk about some of these denominational issues. And one of the ones that I first published for them was this idea of what's called a zombie denomination. I don't think I coined that phrase. I think Aaron Wrenn might have used it, or he might have even borrowed it from somebody else. But it speaks exactly to what you've been talking about. These denominations, these institutions, these mission boards that have so much money but have no missions, or have no people in them, or no students, or and that's really not true. They do have some students, but really what they're, but they're not doing what they originally set out to do, right? So so what I'm calling them are zombie denominations. And what I've seen, and this touches on something that's happening in Connecticut right now with a House Bill 5002 that just got passed by a supermajority in both houses, and it's on the governor's desk to sign. But what it would do is basically strip all towns of home rule of zoning rights, and consolidate zoning and housing at Hartford. And you're probably saying, well, what does that have to do with what you're talking about, Jake? Well, here's what it has to do with, because if you look at all of these closed church properties that are popping up all across the landscape, they're white elephants, right? I mean, you cannot sell a church. Nobody wants to buy a church. There's no thriving congregation that wants to take on an old historic church that's got, $2 or $3 million worth of deferred maintenance, right? So you can't sell them. They're often in historical districts so you can't change them. They might be landmarked even, so you really can't do anything to them. You can't tear them down. So they become a burden. When the congregation fails, the town is left wondering, what do we do with this wreck, this thing that's falling down? Well, the solution happens to be your local neighborhood friendly developer can come in and pay bottom dollar for that church, and then flip it into a 30 or 50 unit low income housing site. They can gut the interior and put in condos or whatever they're going to do. And so the towns normally would say, well, we have all kinds of rules around this. We have zoning restrictions. We have parking requirements and whatnot. But bills like they're passing in Connecticut, there's one that's going through in New York that's already been done in California, strip the towns of their power to stop this. Turn these white elephant properties, and it doesn't just have to be churches, but turn these white elephant properties into cash cows for developers who come in and say they're going to put in low income housing. What I've found is that it often that's a bit of a scam based on criteria that's pretty a moving target, and usually only sets the floor for what today's low income housing is tomorrow's market rate housing, is what I'm saying. So there's these zombie denominations have a vested interest in actually seeing these churches close, because once the church closes, guess what? As you said, even though they're totally independent in a polity like the United Church of Christ, who are they going to give the property to? Well, the next body up happens to be whatever, the conference or the denomination. Right. Can come in and say, well, we're the obvious successor, or we're the heir apparent, or they can even get the 3 or 4 members who are left to have a meeting and vote to hand over the deed. And then what you've done is you've increased their endowment that much more to do anything but spread the gospel of Christ. And it does nothing for the towns, and the church, the town loses a vital piece of its history, and the gospel isn't served.
Right.
So American Reformer ran that article, and I wrote that up in American Reformer for the first time, and it got a lot of traction.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things I think that is troubling about not just the state of affairs, but the fact that churches who maybe have a historic connection to some of these denominations have created such a kind of emotional distance from them that there's almost no interest in even hearing about these things, or figuring out ways to maybe step in later at a later point, and see if there might be a possible way to, well, as you've noted, conduct a reconquista and actually bring back these properties into a gospel preaching, gospel ministry framework.
That's right. There is that alienation, and it runs deep. There's demoralization. I think a lot of the clergy in the Episcopal Church, and probably in other denominations, have just given up if they're conservative. Right. I know far too many. Or I was talking to one the other day, and he's probably 5 years away from retirement, and he thought, should I even try? He was talking about doing something, and he's like, he was asking me, should I even bother with this? And because all I need to do is lay low for another 5 years. And I think that's true of that baby boom cohort. cohort. I'm Gen X, so I got 10 or 15 years into the thing before I was tapped out. But it's unfortunate because I think it's negative. It's a negative incentive, right? You're incentivized not to do anything. And I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong. They're still preaching the gospel. They're being faithful, but they're doing nothing to secure the succession for the next. Who are they going to hand it off to? Because the seminaries aren't graduating anymore like them, and the bishops or the presbyteries or whatever are not ordaining them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's bad. And a lot of them, they've lost the will to think they're going to make any kind of impact there.
Yep.
And they see the fact that if they start raising issues, there's certain things that are at risk that they've invested their whole life in.
Well, and that's what happened to me in the Episcopal Church. I mean, I had churches in Connecticut, Episcopal churches in Connecticut, emailing me based on my preaching. I had a Substack. I was starting to get some, publicity around, the Reconquista and the stuff I was doing with that. I'd been on a few podcasts, so my name was in circulation, and I had one or two churches in Connecticut reach out to me and ask me to apply, and only to find out my application was never forwarded, right? And then eventually I was told, well, no, I'm not the right fit for the diocese. And I'm like, well, wait a second, you got churches who are interested in interviewing me. How could I not be the right fit for the diocese? It's not the diocese that's right. Interested in hiring me. It's the church. And so you realize that, and this goes back to something that I'm starting to see make the rounds. It's like, bishops and presbyteries and sessions and vestries and councils, there's things called bylaws. There's things called canons. There's even things called, state law, which govern religious corporations. There's actually rules that need to be followed, and they spell out how you can call pastors and how you can have annual meetings and how you can conduct elections and who your members are. And this aligns with what I'm talking about with donor intent, because the way the canons of the Episcopal Church are set up, it's very clear that the congregations have the authority to call their priest, to call their rector. If you're a priest or a rector in good standing, which I was, there's no objection a bishop can raise. A bishop can give counsel and advice and can lobby hard against you. But once you've made it to that point where you have a vestry that's actually elected you as rector, you're the rector elect. The bishop can't do anything. But to your earlier point about all of these, elite capture of these interlocking organizations, the elites have captured the episcopacy, they've captured the presbyteries and the seminaries, and they lord it over them, right? As Jesus said, he said they act like the Gentiles and lord it over their flock, and so I heard so many times, senior wardens, in one case it was particularly egregious, a 1928 prayer book parish that, boy, was I the perfect fit for them, and everyone knew it, but the senior warden wouldn't face down the bishop.
Yeah.
Well, that brings up something that I think is worth considering, and that is kind of the loss of spirit. I mean, thumos, the willingness to fight. What you've had is people who've gotten worn down over time, discouraged. But I also think that there's a kind of nice guy problem, generally speaking, when it comes to conservatives. Basically, my experience, I'm a conservative, but I think that generally one of the things that a blind spot for conservatives is, generally speaking, conservatives are good-hearted people that give other people credit for being good-hearted too.
That's right.
And they get taken advantage of again and again and again and again and again because of that.
And the flip side is as much of a smiley face and love is love that the liberals try to put on. They're nasty beasts.
They are nasty people.
They go after full throttle conservatives and orthodox and want to dismantle their ability to practice ministry.
They want to ruin your life. They really do.
Right. Yeah, they're not good people.
Right. But the flip side of that, though, is that the liberals make exactly the same mistake when it comes to other cultures.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
In other words, they assume that everybody is just like them and want exactly the same things they want and so on, which is why they are so adamant in favor of open borders and letting everybody in, without realizing that there are certain kind of fish you don't want to put in the same tank.
Well, that's it.
Yeah. I wonder about those folks sometimes, though, Glenn. I wonder if they do have a death wish, and that there's actually a kind of implicity in their own minds that they're playing too. They're actually just inviting the end of the thing that they hate, which is essentially normality and things at work. Anyway, so let's kick it back over to you, Jake.
I think that's true. I mean, there's a spiritual aspect to this. I mean, I knew in the fall of 1991, when I was a freshman at Yale, that I wanted to go into the ordained ministry. And immediately upon sort of my announcement of that, the opposition started, right? And I was told in no uncertain terms, even by friendly people who are just trying to wave me off, they don't want anybody like you. They don't want you anymore or your kind anymore. So I think it is spiritual, but that was, over 30 years ago. And I naively thought for decades that liberals were just like me in the sense that they wanted successful big churches too. But they just wanted their churches to be filled with liberals. And then it dawned on me 5 years ago that no, they didn't want their churches to be full at all. Right? They wanted the institution to be liquidated, and that goes back to what I'm saying about the property issues and the reason and the need for a litigation trust and a need to really say no. This is not. There's an example in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where the first Congregational church is now a mosque. Now I don't know the terms of that sale, but I can guarantee you that the people who gave money for that to be built in the 1920s and 30s never intended for it to become a mosque. It's right. Just not what it was. So whatever this, I mean, I'm not saying you can't ultimately sell the assets of a defunct church, but there's due diligence that's required here. There are heirs to that Bridgeport church who may have had a claim there that was ignored.
Right. So I think one of the things that, and I was more or less hinting at this earlier when I talked about the indifference that many, good-hearted Christian people, say in the Midwest or the West Coast, have toward this state of affairs here in our part of the country with regard to historic churches and their demise. We need to develop a little more territorialism in the sense that these things, these buildings and these institutions were consecrated to the service of the Christian faith.
That's right,
and that we really do have a stake in them.
Right.
So you might be like in Indianapolis attending XYZ, River of Life non-denominational church.
Right.
But I want you to know, folks, if that's you have a stake in this stuff.
That's right.
You just can't say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me. Yes, it does have something to do with you.
And Chris, I think another point, and I think this is something that came to mind when I actually saw that we were going to do this show with this topic, is I do think that there is a world of orthodox gospel-centered Christians that are mainline in their worship interests, that don't want to have the label of that kind of evangelical, but that's the only place they can go because these other institutions have been redefined and redirected. Right. And I think there is something that is owed to that Christian heritage that was also a faithful vehicle of the gospel for so long that does need reclaiming and retrieving.
Well, let's just think about Jonathan Edwards' churches in Connecticut, or the one in Massachusetts and the other in Connecticut. They've got rainbow flags all over them right now. So if you were to go to those churches and say, because you're interested in the legacy of Jonathan Edwards, there's nothing about that ministry today that has any resemblance to what he was up to.
And they're actually embarrassed about their connection to him.
Probably, yeah, exactly. Well, something was making the rounds on X a few weeks ago from Ryan Burge, his graphic on the presidential vote choice among mainline Protestants, 2008 to 2024, and he's dividing it between red and blue, Republican and Democrat. 2008, 49% of the mainline Protestants voted red. By 2024, it had gone up to 58%. So nearly 60% of these mainline Protestant denominations are voted for Donald Trump in the last election. That ought to tell you everything you need to know about the viability of these of a taking back of these churches. They're held captive, right? I mean, what's needed is someone to go in and liberate them. I mean, people object to the term Operation Reconquista because of a variety of reasons, but call it what you will. Return of the Exiles, whatever it is, there's a need for this.
Yes.
Right. Well, I'm actually kind of glad that we took back the Iberian Peninsula. I think that's a good, that was a positive development.
Right.
Anyway,
Among other things, they produce really good wines, which they wouldn't if they were under Muslims.
That's right. That's right. So, Glenn, you were wanting to say something. I think a little while back. Maybe cut you off.
Well, one of the phenomena we're seeing right now, and Ryan Burge talks about this with I believe Britain, is there are large numbers of young men returning to churches.
Mm-mm.
For the first time, we're seeing more men than women in certain age cohorts coming back to churches, particularly younger ones. But the churches that they are attracted to are very traditional churches. It's Orthodox, it's Catholic, it's Anglican, and often Anglo-Catholic. And I think the reason for that is they want something that's got a level of depth, a different kind of substance than you get out of your typical evangelical church, or for that matter, your typical Presbyterian church.
Right.
And so it seems to me that by itself, the fact that they want orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
And they want historic tradition. They want all of those things. That could be a really tremendous long-term asset for a reconquista.
That's right.
Yeah, I remember years ago I was a guy that was kind of on the alt-right reached out to me, and fascinating guy. Both of his parents were anthropologists and taught at University of Southern California, USC. And anyway, he had been an Obama delegate for the first term, but by the time he connected with me, obviously that wasn't the case anymore. The turning point for him is he did a tour of the world and came back kind of pretty much like the West is best, and let's just kind of own that. Anyway, but I asked him about his Christian faith, and he didn't have one at that point. And I said, well, why'd you reach out to me? You know that I'm a pastor and so forth. He reached out to me mainly because of my writing on masculinity and stuff. But as we got into what the options were for him, he was in the Pacific Northwest, and he said it's all these sort of very very kind of soft rock kind of in Connecticut we call the K-Love channel, that kind of music and stuff like that, and it just kind of it was aesthetically repellent to him.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of this is the irony of over the last 30 years, there's been this downgrading or downplaying of the sort of churchiness of churches and their historic character to make them more, I guess kind of like, I don't know, office parks or shopping malls or whatever. And young guys are not interested in that. Now, maybe the young gals are still interested in that. Maybe they're still into the K-Love Christianity, but definitely the young guys have absolutely no interest in that.
I completely agree. As I said, I'm Generation X. My parents, my father was a Presbyterian, grew up Presbyterian. My mother grew up Roman Catholic. They both got into Eastern religion when they were, in the 1960s. And I wasn't raised as anything, right? So I was, in the leading edge of that nun cohort. So by the time I got interested, came of age, and I was, interested in religion, I wanted the traditional religion. That's what I was looking for.
Right.
And this was in the late 80s and early 90s. And so the big box evangelical church was still running and going very strong. And, I had friends who were into, was it Michael W. Smith or sort of the contemporary Christian music scene or whatever. And I was like, no, give me hymns, give me pipe work. And so I think I probably anticipated what we're seeing now on a larger wave, which I'm excited for. But yeah, I completely get that, and I think that's true.
Yeah,
particularly for the men,
Yeah, you came from the same generation I do, so I knew everything you were just saying.
Yeah.
But when it comes to kind of next steps, so let's think about your dream scenario, Jake. So you've already hinted at a few things, but do you have some kind of like way you'd love to see things play out? Let's say the Theology Pugcast is on board, and I think we are, and we want to help you make this happen. You're needing what? Just to reiterate.
Well, we need money to get this started, to do some exploratory, testing. We need to get some real legal counsel. That a lot of attorneys I talk to are very afraid to touch anything that has to do with the church. And a lot of even more conservative Christian types are looking at the First Amendment, but they look at it from the point of view of, well, we don't want to do anything that jeopardizes religious liberty or that would negatively impact the church. And so they're in a weird way, they end up sort of defending the progressive takeover of the church. Yeah. So we have to work against. We have to sort of
we call those guys David French.
Yeah, exactly. So and I do think there is going back to the idea of burnout. There is a sense in that older generation now that's like, well, we tried to do that and we had to start the ACNA or we had to start the PCA, and so this is impossible. We tried to do it. Let's not even worth it. So we are working against that. But I also think in terms of legal strategy, what we need I need to talk to some attorneys who look at this the way they looked at the opportunity to go after big tobacco back in the day.
Right.
It's like we need somebody who's willing to think creatively and aggressively and say, yeah, you know what? Potentially there's millions, if not more, dollars at stake here, and there are plenty of heirs who may have no interest in Christianity whatsoever, and we're not necessarily trying to talk them into that, but they might be interested in a $10 million settlement payday.
I'd be interested in a vacation home on Nantucket.
That's right. And all they need to do is assign their rights to this litigation trust. So I need attorneys who think that way and who have the vision and are creative and aggressive and want to do it for the kingdom, but also have the opportunity, I think, not to lose money, because the litigation trust would obviously pay the attorneys and pay the genealogists and pay the historians. So I think we're looking at just some initial startup costs here, so that we can get started, and then as we go forward, get a better idea of what would the investment really look like.
Now, I know that in our conversation we talked a little bit about some next steps. So let's say, for example, you get a nice sum of money collected. What would be the dream from that point on?
So the dream, I think, at that point is to build out the idea of the litigation trust, to see what kind of case we can bring, what kind of settlement we might get, and then assuming that let's just say we got $100 million, and we now have a trust that's worth $100 million. What are we going to do with that? Well, we can go and we can go to churches like mine that are just barely scraping by and say, we have relief. We have a solution for you. We have a path forward for you. You can chip in whatever you can chip in, but we're going to cover the rest. We're going to get you a pastor, out of something like, out of any of these conservative denominations, conservative seminaries, who wants to go into an old mainline church and save it and take it back. It's going to take a certain constitution to do that, but we'll be walking with him during that. We'll be training him, guiding him, mentoring him during that. We'll tell the churches that we have the money to help them get through the next 5 years. We'll be able to tell the pastors and their families, especially if they've got young children, that's taken care of.
Right.
So the money's there. We got men who want to go to seminary or complete their seminary. We would fund that so that they can get out of it or pay their loans or not get into debt in the first place. And like I said, I think part of it, we need to get some kind of, if there's a settlement, we need to get some kind of, have to have some kind of leverage here so that the denominations don't try to block or harass our guys once they're in place.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think that was really important to have stated, because it's not just about collecting a bunch of money, and it's not about something just like as a personal vendetta that you've got. This is right. This is part of a larger vision to see a recovery, a taking back of property and even bringing back into sort of a larger Christian endeavor, congregations that maybe don't even have an awareness that there are others out there that think about these things or have the same concerns they have.
When I was in search for most of last year, I talked to dozens of congregations in the Episcopal Church, in the Congregational Church, in various settings, and I met so many just aging 70, 80-year-olds on the vestries, on the search committees, who were just so grateful anyone would even talk to them, that anyone would even apply for their church, right? And so yes, but you know what? Those people aren't going to be alive in 5 to 10 years. So the window is closing.
Right. And that's, I think, another important thing about getting this thing rolling along. I'd love to see this happen. So, Tom, anything else you want to add or questions you want to ask as we kind of wrap things up here?
I don't think any more questions. I'd be curious to kind of see where things go from this. This is definitely very interesting. I just do know a lot of the old war stories of the horrors people went through, especially in the Episcopal Church, just with losing their building and endowments and the pure punishment. And yet these people remained faithful. If they had something like this in place, it probably would have changed the whole game.
Right. Anything, Glenn, you want to add or questions you want to ask?
I remember, I think the case you're referring to, Jake, about the church that got turned into a mosque. If I remember right, it was an Episcopal church. And the defense of the act was, there was a conservative, the conservative people had wanted to hold on to the church, but it was confiscated because, they were leaving the denomination. And that's the way the bylaws were written, even though they had paid for the church themselves a long time ago. But the denomination refused to sell it to them because they said, we're not going to sell it to a rival. We'll sell it to the Muslims, but we're not going to sell it to a rival Christian organization.
Right. Crazy
that
stuff.
Very idea of a rival tells you where the problem is.
Right. And I think that this is where an aggressive, creative legal strategy can really point out the fallacy there or the hypocrisy of that. And, and if you can get an attorney general, even just one in one state, to take an interest in that, then you've got standing because, guess what? These denominations are incorporated in some state, but they do business in all 50.
Yeah.
Right. Well, anyway, as we wrap this up, Jake, is there anything that you'd like to say, just kind of as by way of a final appeal? Anything you want us to pray for?
Well, pray for this. I think it takes a certain amount of, God's, willingness to just surrender to what God's plan is here in this, and that this needs to be for His glory. But I also look at the landscape of this country and I see all of our churches that were built for His glory, and they do glorify the landscape. They glorify our towns. They witness to Him as beacons, and we can't let them go without a fight. We've got to fight for the soul of America, and that's part of what this is. The denominations of America represent, the Protestant denominations especially of America represent the soul of America. So this is a battle for that soul.
Right. And if you are familiar with New England and you drive around, you see the witness of those old white clapboard churches on every town green. And the reason the steeple is pointing to the sky is because it's intended to get you looking upward and thinking about your own spiritual state.
Yep.
And what's, I think, also kind of remarkable is that they're, even in the most liberal towns, they are cherished, those old historic buildings, which, again, it might come as a surprise to some people. But I would imagine that even the most, I guess, secular people would be in some sense disappointed if their local, town green white clapboard church was turned into, I don't know, a coffee shop or that sort of thing.
Was it Christopher Hitchens or whomever, one of those new atheists who lamented a few years ago that, England was becoming Muslim and where were the Christmas carols? And it was sort of like, well, what did you do to help? But
that's right.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen the new book floating around that's written, was just recently written. I can't remember the author, but it's called God as an Englishman. Basically, the way Christianity has so stamped the culture, it makes no sense. Well, you could pretty much say the same thing. God's a New Englander in the sense that the whole place is intoxicated with buildings and history of the Christian faith, and most of which does not exhibit anything familiar with the real faith.
Right. Yeah. To end this on a positive note, I can think of half a dozen churches just off the top of my head, which were churches that had, kind of shriveled up to almost nothing. And then a person like you, Jake, came in and over the course of about a decade turned those places into thriving and vibrant congregations. So my hope is high for you and your work there. in Woodbury, and we hope that folks who have been listening to the show and maybe are even in New England. We actually do have a number of people in New England who listen to the show and who live in Connecticut. Maybe they can come by and check you out and try to encourage you and work with you a little bit.
That would be great. We'd love to have them. 10 a.m. on Sundays in First Church in Woodbury.
All right. Great. Well, anyway, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. And if you like what we do, you can help us out by becoming a patron. We have a Patreon account, and we've had a few people who have joined that account here recently and helped to strengthen the monthly giving, and we're very grateful for that. But if you'd like to be a part of that, you could follow the link in the show notes to that. We'll also have links in the show notes to Jake's church and to some of the other things that he gives to us to share with you. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.